Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS. It's Ukraine War News Update, third part for the 12th of June 2024. Let's start with Georgia, where they, actually not in Georgia, but in Moscow, in Russia. Georgia are potentially going to reopen their embassy there. According to Georgian TV channel, Matvari Arki, representatives of the Georgian Dream, which is a pro-Russian ruling party there, and the Russian authorities are working on restoring diplomatic relations. The selection of staff for the new Georgian embassy in the Russian capital is already underway. Georgia broke off diplomatic relations with Russia and closed its embassy in Moscow in 2008 after the Russian invasion of Georgia. Oh my goodness. So it's a long way. It's a long time since then, I guess. And Georgian Dream really are compromised as a ruling party, such that they would want to. It's like Stockholm syndrome or something. They want to do business and make it all right with the very people who invaded them and that presently control two areas of their country. It's not formal annexation, but there are two areas of Georgia that the Russians are using. So that's Georgian Dream for you. Right, let's pop into Emmanuel Macron's political landscape for a wee while. He has called a snap election. I've talked about this previously. I was listening to an interview with Andrew Marr actually on New Statesman, talking about how Jordan Bardella, the 28-year-old, very very young, charismatic leader of Rassemblement National, the National Rally of France, Marine Le Pen's kind of option for who will be a prime minister if in these elections the RN, Rassemblement National, do well in a cohabitation where you've got Emmanuel Macron as president and Bardella as prime minister. But Bardella isn't, like, he's not squeaky clean. He has liked things on Twitter, for example, from actual fascist groups, so I guess he might get a bit of a free pass because he's son of immigrants from Italy, but he has got some pretty dubious views, and that kind of aligns with the positioning of Rassemblement National. Now the news out is that the centre-right party, the regular kind of conservative party of France, or the leader of Les Républicains, has said he's open to doing a deal with National Rally. Now, this is something that hasn't happened before. Usually, all the political parties coalesce against the far right to make sure the far right don't get into power. And now you've heard that the leader from Les Républicains said, no, I'm cool with doing a deal. However, he hadn't told people in his party, and I think that's causing quite a bit of a ruckus internally within the centre-right political party in France. So it's quite incredible how and this is exactly what Marine Le Pen would want, which is a normalisation of the far right in France. So you're normalising it. You're starting to have people say, yeah, we'll do a deal with you. Yep, okay, let's vote, see how well you guys do. Yep. And they are now part of the fabric. They aren't the fringe. They are now mainstream. That is a far cry from 40 years ago when we're living memory of fascism in Europe post World War II. So quite an incredible situation in France. Anyway, Emmanuel Macron, a lot of not gall, I guess, or courage or risk in calling a snap election in less than a month. Emmanuel Macron is nothing if not a risk taker. Without that quality, he would never have won the French presidency. But this time his gamble is putting his legacy and credibility on the line. Why did he do it, and where will it lead, says Sophie Peder. The president's calculation seems to be that in the coming months he was likely to face an irresistible political demand for fresh parliamentary elections. By dissolving parliament now, Macron has at least made the choice his and controlled the timing. More than this, Macron seeks what an advisor calls a, quote, moment of clarification, or what others might say constitutes calling voters bluff. Either popular support for the RN is real, and he will try to put his policies under proper scrutiny and expose their contradictions, or the high Rassemblement National vote represents a midterm protest which would not survive at its current level when the stakes are about the daily government of France rather than the apparently distant running of the EU. There are some people who say actually you're more likely to get that far right expression support for the RN here in the European elections. And when it comes to domestic elections, you kind of go back to your normal parties that you vote for within your different areas and whatnot. So I guess we'll wait and see. To this end, Renaissance is seeking to force their other moderate party, so that's Macron's party, to support a Republican front against the RN and choose between the broad centre and the extremes. Séjourné, that's his foreign minister, has said that the party will not put up candidates against Republican opposition contenders. That's really interesting. The point ultimately for Macron is to try to broaden parliamentary representation among those parties that might be willing to contemplate coalition talks with Renaissance. So in other words, instead of putting lots of effort into fielding candidates in areas where you will split the vote against RN and RN will win, this is what I've argued should have been happening in the UK for a long time. We should have had what's called a progressive alliance of Lib Dem, Labour and Greens getting together and not standing. You pick which one's strongest for each particular candidate, and you don't field candidates when, you don't field 3 candidates, you just field 1. And this is what he's saying for Renaissance. We won't field where someone else is looking strong to have some kind of Republican ideal that is against the far right. And that's his thinking. From his point of view, if the political left is split up along the way, so much the better. Yet coalition talks based around Renaissance got nowhere in the past and maybe no more successful this time round. Macron remains unpopular. And the chances are that far from shoring up his party at fresh elections, he will lose seats. So just to give international people here outside of France, and I'm no French political expert, mind, Macron is unpopular, and he's unpopular because he's basically a centrist, which means that he's trying to do things that he thinks is sensible for the country, but will annoy people on both sides of him. One example is raising the retirement age, pension age. And this is something, and I know I'll have French people having a go at me, but this is something that France probably really needs to do. It's got the lowest retirement pension age, I think, out of the major countries in Europe, certainly lower than the UK. And we kind of moved our retirement age. When I was teaching, it went up from 63 to 67. Okay. And everyone was like, oh, are you serious? Really? All right, get back to work. And that was that. Whereas in France, with a highly unionised workforce, it's incredibly unionised. I remember I was teaching in France once, and back as part of my university course. And at the time, it was in Toulouse, and they had something like, I don't know, the postman went on strike, and then the students went on strike, then the teachers went on strike, and then like OAPs went on strike. And you're like, pensioners are going on strike. What are you striking from? You're retired. Everyone's out marching, doing all sorts. So that's what they're like. And that was deeply, deeply unpopular. You then had the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, who came out. They were interestingly whipped up and amplified by Russia, of all places. Not that they didn't have genuine grievances, but they were amplified by Russia. And so, Macron is not a particularly popular person because he's actually had, again, the gall to take unpopular decisions for what he sees as the betterment of the country. But of course, that means with the general public, where they're thinking, I'm going to have to work longer, I can't draw my pension till later. That's an issue, and yet the model they presently got is unsustainable with growing longevity, so on and so forth. Now I know some French people no doubt get annoyed with me and say actually there are other ways around this, but I think really you need to raise the retirement age. But anyway, the fact is he's unpopular nationally, even though we look at him at the moment, he's saying all the right things in terms of Ukraine, and absolutely, and I'm fully behind him on that. And I think he has been the strongest, certainly rhetorically, on Ukraine, basically since maybe Boris Johnson. The most likely outcome after 2 rounds of voting. So the French do 2 rounds, and they whittle it down to the first round, and then they take the top 2, is it? And then everyone votes on the top 2. So you get 2 rounds of voting. The most likely outcome after 2 rounds of voting on June the 30th and July the 7th, so the first round is at the end of this month, then July the 7th, is a hung parliament. At best, in other words, no party has the overall majority over 50% of the seats, and so you have to do a coalition. At best, this would bring forth a German-style coalition. At worst, it would produce a parliamentary deadlock and potentially in time more elections. If, as seems possible, the Rassemblement National emerges as the single biggest party, it may in fact be best placed to build a coalition. There are signs of outreach to the nationalist wing of the Republicans, which I was just talking about, Les Républicains. Well, at least the leader said that he's open for deals. The prospect has already spooked the markets. Macron knows his history and that Chirac's decision in 1997 to dissolve parliament ended in tears and 5 years of cohabitation with a socialist government. But Macron also often thinks he can defy precedent and pull off things that others cannot. Macron may even be gambling that the demands of government might expose the voters, the Rassemblement National's incompetence and undermine its appeal ahead of the 2027 presidential election. That may be wishful thinking. Either way, Macron's legacy as well as his credibility is now on the line. Okay, in terms of Ukraine war though, what that means is if a new government is formed which involves a coalition with the Rassemblement National, you have an issue with support for Ukraine because they are far, far less likely to provide Ukraine with political support. Now, you would have a cohabitation, and Macron has said he will stay in, no matter what the results of the election is, and I'm really happy he said this, he said, I will stay in as president. I have a mandate until 2027. He can't be voted in after 2027, so it'll have to be someone else. It's looking like Marine Le Pen is sizing herself up to be the president. So that's what her position is looking to be. She and her Jordan Bardella below as prime minister is how she'd want it. But the idea for many French people is, or for some analysts, is that if the RN get in some form, that they won't be very good at governing. And so when 2027 comes along, you might get a repudiation of RN. So that's the situation there. Somebody's asked me to do a little primer on the UK elections coming up, which I did before, by the way. I have done a primer on that based on the local elections we had, but I will give you my tuppence soon on the UK elections. Right, the largest buyer of Russian gas in the EU has cancelled its contract with Russia. This is super important. So we've had these situations where Europe is continuing to buy hydrocarbons from Russia, and part of it is actually just legal obligation. Right, you're in like a 10-year, 8-year, 6-year contract, whatever. The war started, you're like, damn, you guys suck. We don't want to buy stuff off you. And then the other guys go, yeah, but we've got a contract and you've signed it, so suck on that. And that's kind of how it's been. And so Europe have gone, okay, well, we'll keep having all your cheap hydrocarbons then. Oh, twist my arm. Oh, okay, cheap hydrocarbons. We're under contract. And there have been these arguments about whether the contracts can be annulled, etc., etc. So German gas giant Uniper has announced that it has terminated long-term gas supply contracts with Gazprom. The company decided to break the contract after a favourable decision in the arbitration court. The court awarded Uniper more than 13 billion euros in compensation for non-delivery of gas. What happened after the explosion of Nord Stream gas pipeline, basically. The episode was recognised by the courts as force majeure. This contract was to be valid for another 10 years until 2035. This is really great for getting Europe, for getting Germany here off dependence on Russian hydrocarbons. So that's absolutely brilliant. And hopefully we'll see Gazprom suffer even more. Right to terminate that contract with Russia's Gazprom and more than 13 billion euros, $14 billion in damages. So quite incredible. That we've seen that Gazprom is tanking at the moment. It's made losses last year, which it hasn't done for, I don't know how long it was, 30 years or something. And it has also got the prospect of having taxes raised on it by the Russian government next year. Now, talking about the Russian government, while everyone slept, Medvedev has won already and painted Ukraine in the colours of the Russian flag. So here's a bit of a TV snippet coming out, and you've got over on the left here, you have there you've got Crimea, you have got Ukraine painted fully under the flag, the whole of Ukraine under the flag of Russia. I mean, it's really just, it takes a mickey, doesn't it? But that's what they're like. They're like, yeah, we own it now. Yeah, no, there's a government in Kiev. They're interacting with all these other allied nations. Like, you don't really control it, do you? Yeah, we do, because look, we painted it on a map. So look at the map. The map is the truth. Don't confuse the map with the terrain, as they say. Right, Anton Gershchenko here says Putin's family continues to live luxuriously, bypassing sanctions. That's very nice. Despite the ban on the sale of yachts to Russia, a company associated with Putin's nephew, Mikhail Shelemov, recently purchased the luxury French sailboat, the Immortal Dreamer. According to the Insider journalist, so the Insider is what Colby Badwell writes for. It's a Russian exiled media outlet. The sailboat Immortal Dreamer was built in France in 2023. The design of this model, Lagoon 77, was worked on by the famous Patrick Lequimont. The yacht has 4 cabins and can accommodate up to 18 passengers. Launched in early 2023, and in August, according to customs documents, it was bought by Russia, brought by Russia. Brought to Russia by transit through Turkey. The company Brevestnik Group acted as an intermediary. Its owner, Andrei Boyko, is known as a yacht importer close to the Kremlin. And these are the areas where people often complain that there's this porous border between Russia and the outside world in terms of they can get their hands on luxury things when they really want to. And Turkey here appears to be something of the conduit. According to investigative journalists, the company, which services the business jet of Alina Kabayeva, Putin's rumoured lover, freely imports Western-made parts. At the same time, Russian civil aviation faces constant breakdowns due to a shortage of spare parts. Kabayeva, on the other hand, uses a $22 million Falcon 7X plane. This business jet is maintained by Rusair. So those with money can get their stuff. Right, let's go on to a little bit of criticism for the US and indeed, one might say, Olaf Scholz and basically all allied nations to some degree. I think UK have been all right. We've been fairly consistently behind Ukraine. I think the Baltics and Nordics have been fine, and other nations. But some of the bigger nations like Germany, possibly Italy, and the US have been anti-escalation. So what is this? Well, let's have a good. I should do a whole video on reflexive control. This is what you're going to hear of here. Sergei Sumleny here says, "This is the best interview on Russian nuclear mongering I have ever seen. Watch the brilliant. Who is he? He's William Alberg." From the Stimson Center, a former IISS Technology and Arms Control Director, explaining complicated things. This is part of it doesn't matter anyway, so this is worth a little look. Listen to what he has to say.
When you think about the past 30 years that Putin has been watching the West, to him, he sees a West that is willing to take some risks, but not willing to take casualties, that may intervene in conflicts, but doesn't really have a stomach for the long fight and will eventually walk away, and is deadly afraid of nuclear threats, of nuclear escalation, of fears of escalation. We say all the time, you hear the President of the United States, you hear President, Secretary General, like everybody talks about escalation and fears of Russian nuclear weapons use. So what the lesson Putin takes away from that is, if he threatens us, if he threatens nuclear use, we'll back down. The whole idea.
You've got to remember, everything that happens all the time, we're learning. We are learning all the time. You know, when I'm interacting with you guys and when I'm doing my videos, I'm always learning, oh, that's happened, so I need to do this next time that happened. Constantly, our behaviours are being affected by what we're picking up. So it's trivially true that Putin's just going to be interacting with the Western world and learning all the time from that. And he learns that whenever he rattles his saber, people get freaked out. The US gets freaked out. The Biden administration, particularly with Jake Sullivan, etc., get freaked out, and he gets to control the narrative. He gets to control the red lines for this war. And this is why Emmanuel Macron, it was so important that he came out and said, no, we need to be taking control of the red lines. We need to be setting out our own red lines for Putin, not the other way around. But this is the idea of reflexive control.
Britain's nuclear use will back down. The whole idea of Putin's strategy is how does he get us to internalize inhibition? Some people call this self-deterrence. I don't think that's the right word. It's how can we internalize Russian thinking? It's an old Soviet concept. I'm sure you're well aware of it. Reflexive control. How can he make your choices limited to choices that are only the ones that are acceptable to Putin rather than all of the choices? So, for instance, when we go into the Ukraine war, supporting Ukraine, immediately the United States says, well, we're not going to do this, 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 and this. That tells Russia that we're afraid, that we're weak. Whereas if you said all options are on the table, that would send a message back to Russia that, they're not really that intimidated.
And this is exactly, again, what Macron and others have been doing, which is we need to not draw our own red lines and say, well, we can't send troops. It's not that we are going to send troops, is that we need to leave them thinking. There needs to be strategic ambiguity so that we're getting back some of that control of the narrative. No, we may send troops. We're not putting it off the table. Right. But yet, as soon as Macron did that, other countries came out and said, yeah, but we're not going to send troops. And you don't need to say that. Keep it quiet. You just say nothing. I'd rather the US and actually, I don't think the US has so formally said it as other countries, but, Germany, I know Germany needs to change laws in the Bundestag and whatnot in order to send troops, but just don't say anything. And even if you're directly asked, go, well, we haven't really considered it yet. We'll be talking about it back in government or whatever. Just give that strategic ambiguity sense out to the Russians so it keeps them guessing. But instead, everyone, half of people are like, no, we definitely won't do that. And even when we do, it's going off on one a bit, but even when we do give permission to do X and Y, like use ATACMS or use HIMARS rockets, missiles into Russia, just don't announce it. Just let Ukraine do it, and then you'll find out when they use them. Anyway,
this debate that we have internally, we can't supply this because Russia might do that. Putin's laughing. We've seen time and time again when we cross a so-called red line of Russia's, he doesn't escalate any more than this entire conflict, which has been to kill the Ukrainian population. All he does is he makes some bluster and then he backs down, or he just continues with the conflict. So we've given him
every time
credit, and this is a learned behavior. We've taught him that we'll back down. We've taught him that we'll be afraid. So really what you have to do is, the best way you always deal with bullies, you have to stand up to them. And quite frankly, he's making non-credible threats. Now, that said, I do think if the United States were to intervene directly in the conflict out of the blue, Russia would be incredibly intimidated by this, and they might escalate in very real ways and try to strike the United States back. But by supporting Ukraine with any type of weapon system that we can, by helping them 100%, I think the risks of any kind of escalation is very small. But even the fact that the West is having this debate proves that Putin is correct. He is able to make us afraid by doing very little other than just making weird statements or having a random exercise.
And absolutely true. So that's exactly what's happening today. At the moment, the Russians and Belarusians are doing nuclear exercises, which is their saber rattling. And that's still keeping the West back to lesser or greater degrees, depending on what country it is, from doing what should be done, which is providing Ukraine with everything you can and saying, go for it. It's your war, but here's some stuff, but you go and prosecute that war as you see fit. And we'll see you on the other side. It's really insanely frustrating. And then it leaves many people. This then becomes fertile ground for conspiracy style thinking. Although it's not conspiracy theory. Like, I am 50-50 on this. I'm not quite sure. The idea that, well, actually what's really going on is about drip feeding equipment to Ukraine so that it fundamentally degrades Russia. I talked about this right at the beginning of the war. I think I even wrote an article on this because Lloyd Austin even said back in April 2022 that he wanted to see Ukraine, he wanted to see Russia so fundamentally degraded that they couldn't do this again for generations or whatever that his phraseology was. which led people to go, oh, this is a kind of drip feeding on purpose rather than being scared of escalation and then giving things. And then I don't know. I think the latter is probably true. I think it probably is anti-escalation. But I think the collateral of that is that actually, so historians might look back, we might look back in 100 years and it'll be horrendous that Ukraine has been not so much used like this, but the situation turned out that Ukrainians had to die on much larger scales. But actually, that did improve the chances of Russia not being able to do this again for a long time. Like, if the quicker Ukraine had won this war, the fewer Ukrainians will have died. But actually, it might have allowed Russia to have not been so fundamentally degraded, to have the labour shortage they do, to be as desperate as they are, I think, economically and in terms of personnel for the armed forces. But I guess that's a conversation for 50 years' time. But of course, you're always trying to compare that to an alternative history that's never taken place. So it is always going to be speculative. Right. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said that he accepts Hungary's decision not to take part in the alliance's mission to coordinate assistance to Ukraine. In return, Hungary would not block the initiative for other allies. So, as I said in my last video, Victor gets to sit inside, not joining in with everyone else, but NATO gets to do what it still wants to do. So, I suppose this is good. Orban, you're not messing things up. You're not exactly helping, and I'm not sure that you're doing your own power base any favours. I don't think Hungary is coming out of any of this with many friends other than Russia. Nonetheless, that's a way forward for NATO. Now, NATO. Anyone who says NATO provoked Russia to attack Ukraine is either stupid, brainwashed, or simply doesn't know the history. So, Ukrainians against NATO, 66% in October 2013, 20%. Ukrainians for NATO in October 2013. After the Russian occupation of Crimea and Donbass, November 2014, 25% of them were against NATO, 51% for NATO. Then August 2021, after that had subsided a bit, 35% against NATO, 54% for NATO. So both have grown. It's the unknowns there that I think had gone towards being against. And then after the full-scale invasion, January 2023, 3% against Ukrainians against NATO, 86% for. So really interesting shifts there in opinion. Until 2013, only about 20 to 30% of Ukrainians, depending on the poll, were in favour of joining NATO. After the annexation of Crimea, the number went up to more than 50%, and now it's close to 90%. Also, it was a Russian aggression that forced Sweden and Finland to join NATO. It's Russian aggression that has prompted other countries to join NATO and not NATO's expansion, forcing Russia to attack the neighbouring countries. And even the infamous interview of propagandist Tucker Carlson with Putin showed that Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and 2022 had nothing to do with NATO. So this is really important, by the way. So the whole it's NATO encroaching myth is one that was developed by the West and given to and kind of applied to the conflict. In 2014, when the little green men invaded Ukraine and they annexed part of Donbass and Crimea, NATO was never mentioned. This was not part of the reasoning. And that reasoning then is effectively still going to be the reasoning for the full-scale invasion in 2022. Then they added loads of stuff and myths came through and Russian propaganda and it was particularly active and everyone was throwing all these ideas and myths that really do need debunking all over the place, so that people are saying, oh, it's because NATO encroached. NATO encroachment has nothing to do with it. It all had to do with Putin's obsession with the breakup of the Kievan Rus in the 12th century and USSR in the 20th century. He can't accept that Ukrainians are a nation, thus he wants to erase Ukraine from existence, says Roman Sharamalta. But interesting little reminder there. Okay, White House has officially announced a meeting between the US's President Biden and Ukrainian President Zelensky on June the 13th, which is tomorrow at the G7 summit in Italy. So you've got the G7 summit, then you've got the peace conference from the 15th, is it the 15th and 16th? So you've got an awful lot going on this month. French elections later. Kirby noticed, so John Kirby, National Security Advisor, that at the summit they will announce new steps on the issue of frozen sovereign assets of Russia and their direction in favour of Ukraine. One thing I forgot to mention as well with the French election, it is a crazy time to have it. It's just before the Olympics in Paris, and you just hope that there isn't going to be large-scale street protests and all sorts. There's a lot of potential for things to go wrong. Anyway, US Treasury to expand sanctions pressure on Russia by the end of this week, according to the Financial Times. The United States will quadruple the list of Russian companies for work with which they will impose secondary sanctions. It is specified that the restrictions will affect Sberbank, VTB and other banks. Any transaction with an organisation on the list will be equated to cooperation with the Russian defence industry. In addition, the EU may impose sanctions against Russia's largest shipping company, Sovcomflot, which is engaged in oil transportation. Bloomberg also reports that part of the new sanctions concerns exports to Russia of semiconductor chips used for the military industry. I've heard some more about semiconductor chips. So here, Tim White, new sanctions are being introduced in a bid to stop loopholes over the supply of microchips to Russia. This is a huge problem. Had the original restrictions worked, the war would be over by now. I mean, that's a pretty grand claim, but there you go. If you want to pause and read the very small print there, you can do so. Right, moving on. Right, I've just cut out the bit on American politics I'd done. It went on a bit long, so I'm going to put that in an extra a little bit later today, probably tonight. I'm off for a pint and a talk of politics while looking over the sea at my friend's place, who has a place he's got a place that overlooks the sea, and that's going to be nice. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with this that John on Twitter sent to me, so thanks for this. It's a nice emotional ending. I think it'll end this video in a pretty apt way. This is from 9 News Australia. I'd go and check out the whole thing. It's interesting, especially if you're Australian and you haven't seen it. It gives you a really good indication of how Australians have become involved in the war and what they are contributing to Ukraine's success. Australians at the front line of Ukraine's war for freedom, forged in fire. But this is a nice emotional ending here. And indeed, I shed a tear as I watched it last night.
So you were a businessman, you're now a soldier, but you're also a father. We're heading up to Christmas. What do you wish for your children?
There's only one thing that I wish, and I'm not sure if it will happen this year. I just want to give a hug to my daughter and to my son. And the way things are looking now, I think that will have to wait.
But there is reason to hope. If one thing has come into sharp focus in this journey into the heart of darkness, it is that hope is a flame passed person by person. As long as one person has hope, a light always shines in the darkness.
Represent big country or small one, doesn't matter. You represent values.
Individuals matter. Individuals in democracies move governments.
We all been one army. The name of this army is Ukraine.
Unprovoked aggression must be fought. It cannot be rewarded or normalized, or else no country is safe.
You are our friends. Thank you very much for your support and the help. And believe that we are Ukrainian, never forget about it. And our victory will be our joint victory.
Putin didn't understand when he attacked Ukraine that he wouldn't break a country, he would make one. The people refused to kneel and stood up. And around the world, in countries as far away as Australia, individuals rallied behind their courage. 1 million points of light shone in the darkness, and the darkness could never put that out.
Thanks to your people for your support, your government. During the war, there are a lot of countries who are more closer than you to us. But they didn't come during this war to support people. Thank you for this support. You are closer than you think. Thank you so much.
Well, we would think less of ourselves if we did not come.
Thank you very much.
Please take care of yourself.
You look after me. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And we can all make a difference. All of us.